Hi, and welcome to Night Clerk Radio. This is episode 33, Learning About Lo-Fi. We want to give a big shout out to our patrons for their support on patreon.com/nightclerkradio. Our next Patreon episode is probably going to be the philosophy of aesthetics, which ties into anti-capitalist art, memes, and vaporwave. But today, we're going to be going more into lo-fi. We're going to be digging the crates, so to speak, the digital crates.
Walking in the path of DJ Shadow.
Yes, exactly. To explore more of lo-fi hip-hop, because it is such a popular genre, and it is definitely haunted in the hauntological sense, and sometimes the literal sense. You know, there's spooky lo-fi music, and there's multitudes within lo-fi. But yeah, we're picking two different artists to look at the complexity and the layering, the whole range of depths of lo-fi with these two artists. So I'm quite excited. These were both really fun albums. Any initial thoughts there, Burke?
Yeah, I guess want to preface that this episode, we're not really going to get too much into like the history, philosophy, etc. of the genre itself. We covered that pretty well in the Patreon episode. So if that type of stuff that we talk about interests you, then definitely head over to the Patreon, Night Clerk Radio at patreon.com, and learn about the genre itself. I think today for me, what I really wanted to do, and we talked about this in that Patreon episode, is explore this music as albums, not as mixes and streams. And like mixes and streams are great. We've recommended them before as ways to get into a genre, get a sampler, figure out what you like, and then go dig deeper. And I think we're at that dig deeper stage of we listened to a bunch of streams, listened to mixes, etc. for that lo-fi episode, and now I just want to tackle some albums. I want to hear a cohesive piece of art from a singular artist. So that's what's most exciting to me, because that's my favorite way to listen to music.
Yeah, each of these two albums, there are more upbeat, there are more melancholic tracks, and each artist does have a unique style. I mean, the joke about the cliche about lo-fi being a very extremely formulaic genre, you can see a lot of complexity, a lot of different interpretations of what it means to be lo-fi, both within each album and between individual tracks. I thought you did an exceptional job in picking your album.
You as well. I thought your album was pretty good too.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think they'll see from these albums that conception of lo-fi as kind of like a one beat genre instead of one note is really just not true. And I think it was a very educational episode to kind of research and listen and learn about. I think there's a lot to talk about.
So why don't we dive into it? Maybe by Ginseng from his album Transitions, which is his first album of the 2020 decades. His notes for the album are welcome to this decade, basically. And yeah, this is not his first album. I quite enjoyed this. Very jazzy, extremely 70s soul influenced. Yeah, this is in particular my favorite track, and I want to talk about that in a second. But to give you a bit of background, Ginseng is actually publicly known as, he is not anonymous. His real name is Benjamin Tran. He lives in California, and he has been working in the lo-fi genre since 2014, and he has produced several albums. Solitudes is got millions of listens between YouTube and Spotify. He's been frequently on many lo-fi streams. If you've listened to any of those streams for any amount of time, his name will pop up. Quite a few fans. Interestingly, he is self-taught, but he doesn't want to pursue a career in music. He mentioned in a recent interview that he wanted to go into audio engineering as his actual professional career.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So like a related field, but we'll see. I mean, he is quite successful in the field, but given like how little an artist earns per stream, millions of listens on Spotify does not actually account for that much income. So that could be understandable why this would be a side gig for him. But this album is very hauntological in the sense that it's very nostalgic for 70s music, which is music that was before Ginseng's time, quite literally. He's too young to have grown up in the 70s, but he still is obviously very fond of the music. And I also detect a lot of nujabes in that. So what are your overall impressions of the album?
Well, like my first thought was that this is very much what I think of in a good way as like the lo-fi album or like a beat tape, because it just opens, I'm going to say track names because I listened to this on Bandcamp, which has a different track order than some of the YouTube. But just immediately on that first track, which on Bandcamp is Still Thinking. It's just like very classic. Here's a couple chords. Here's some lo-fi drums. And it's just very mellow. It's very chill. It's definitely has parts that are melancholic and I think hint to that sort of like lonely hauntedness of the past. I definitely agree with a lot of the jazz samples. I thought this was just like a really, really enjoyable beat tape. It was really fun to listen to.
Yeah, he actually calls these beat tapes, not like lo-fi album. So if you go to his Bandcamp page, it says this is my new beat tape, and that's what he talks about on Twitter. So I wanted to choose this album because it's not his most popular because it's his newest album. Like I mentioned, Solitude, that's his most popular album. That has like 6 million views, the full album on YouTube. But I wanted to see, because he started very young. Actually, he started, I believe I read an interview where he said he was 19 when he started working on making lo-fi music. So I wanted to see how he has progressed since then. And it does have that lo-fi formula, though. You are right. It is like it establishes a beat and sort of like there's building and sort of like, I would say tricks, but like, he changes it up a bit. But like once the beat is established, that's the core of the song. I think it's fine though, because each song is pretty brief. The average is like 2 to 3 minutes. So it's not really, no track is really overstaying its welcome. But I got a very strong, especially the track we just listened to, maybe a very strong Samurai Champloo Nujabes vibe to it. Maybe, which is that track, is extremely strong because you have that sort of distorted bass line in the beginning and like then the string accompaniment, and there's this kind of sense of light melancholy or wistfulness throughout the entire track. I mean, for me, because I rewatched Samurai Champloo recently, I could almost see fireflies on a moonlit path in a Japanese forest. Like, I think that was my favorite track in the entire album.
I think it was mine as well. So it's the closing track on the Bandcamp release, and it is also the longest track, which I think also helps. Like you kind of feel like you're, I don't know, just a 3.5 minute track feels so long after all these brief little beat experiments. And I think that also adds to kind of that like longing, like you're kind of stuck there in this loop for a little bit longer. But I love it. So I'm not super familiar with the Samurai Champloo soundtrack off the top of my head. So what really stood out to me in this one is those horns, that layering, because the production on this is comparably to a lot of stuff we listen to pretty minimalist. Not in a bad way. It's very purposeful. Like you said, you establish your beat, you have a few chords or melody that's really nice, but there's a lot of background interest that appears throughout tracks. There's like little chimes that kind of help you find your phrasing or like establish longer phrases in a long set of repeated loops. Or there's just like weird sounds like on Patience, the track Patience. It really feels like, first of all, that like the vinyl static effect is really cranked up in that one. Like I feel like you hear it in that track more than others.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The lo-fi-ness of it. Yeah.
But then there's like little laser sound effects that kind of streak through in the middle. And it's just like, oh, okay. Sounds kind of cool. I don't know what it's doing there, but it's cool.
This whole thing about lo-fi is that it's not really too hung up on genre conventions. Like, let's just throw in this because it'll sound cool, not because like, oh, we're this type of music, we can't have this type of instrument in it. There's none of that, sort of purity, I guess. And One thing is this album in particular does a lot of sampling, which our next album does not,
Mhm.
which I found really interesting. But like tracks like Ease In and Lemongrass both have sample albums from the 70s. In fact, there's, according to whosampled.com, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 distinct 1970s albums sampled in this beat tape.
Mhm. Yeah, because it's really only like 30 minutes. So that's a
Mhm.
pretty hefty set of influences.
There's a couple others from later, but like,
Mhm.
yeah, he's really saying something. And not every track is super nostalgic or like melancholy. Like, Showers I thought was really interesting. So why don't we play a sample of that? Showers is almost to me like Ginseng waking up and taking a shower, and like the music accompanies him actually waking up,
Mm.
because the beat, especially at the beginning, is very intrusive, very demanding at 1st.
Mhm.
And like you have these brief licks of saxophone and like the piano, like, yeah. So I quite like that little trick. Like there's a lot of difference between tracks.
One thing, this is probably far into the realm of like overinterpretation, but
Mhm.
on this track, I really liked is that there's little bits of chords played,
Mhm.
and they're not played like in unison. I don't remember the exact musical term, but they're not like arpeggiated, and they're not played in unison, but they're kind of like you just kind of splash across the notes, like you're strumming a guitar almost. You
Mhm.
don't hear everything at the same time. It almost feels like the music's like splashing over you, like it's refreshing.
Mhm.
I don't know. It's a sonic shower. The waking up and stuff is interesting. It's like very peaceful. It's like a morning vibe.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It really grabs your attention, but it's not like dissonant. It's not like a
Mhm.
a noise or a Stroner album or anything. But like it was certainly a change of pace from, say, maybe.
Mhm.
I think the thing is, you might think, well, this quick looping structure of a song, like, here's a 30-second loop, we're going to play like 4 times and change it up each time a little bit, but like that's the song. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because like once you start listening, you really just start vibing with it.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think it's part of the lo-fi hip hop aesthetic in it is the idea of the loop, like making a song to an anime looping GIF, which is really focusing about like a brief moment in time, a momentary mood briefly suspended in time by music. Like that's sort of like, that is what lo-fi is trying to capture. This is an idea I've seen in like Japanese cinema too. Like I was actually thinking, it reminded me of a movie called Afterlife, a movie about a hotel for people who have died, and like this is where their spirit goes. And there's staff at this hotel, and the staff helps each person find a moment in their lives, and then they film this moment, they recreate that moment, and then that's where that person will spend all of eternity. Like that's their afterlife. And the whole thing is about finding that one moment. And so it's almost like finding your perfect anime looping GIF in a kind of reductive way. But like, I would like to imagine this is the kind of album they would play in the lobby.
It's funny because my first thought was that like terrible Liam Neeson movie where he like runs a funeral home with Christina Ricci.
I've not seen that movie. Are they also dead? Is it also about the afterlife?
Don't remember. I just remember it existing.
Wow.
Yours sounds way better and more interesting.
It's quite moving. It's one of those movies. It's not a tragedy, but you feel like all the emotions watching it.
Mhm.
So it's one of those movies I want to rewatch, but I'm not ready to rewatch it yet. There is one more sample I do like, which is from Back Again. I just like this because I just like the song. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, we have a lot of overlap on tracks we liked. I really liked this track too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just love that little vocal sample. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
why. It's
Yeah.
just so just like floats above everything else. And
Mm-hmm.
like it's just really good. I can't I'm trying to think of like why it's really good. It's not like from something I know. Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
sound like anything I know.
It is sampled, I believe.
Sure.
Back Again is from Tear It Down by Blue Magic from 1974. At least that's the sample from it. I did find an interesting discussion of sampling in lo-fi on a subreddit about lo-fi hip hop. So take, a grain of salt, obviously. But it's like, yeah, artists don't clear their samples. They just figure if they get caught, it's easier to pay lawyers than to try and get it pre-cleared, because most of the time you don't get caught. Maybe that's also one of the other reasons why the lo-fi of lo-fi hip hop is so important, because the more you distort it, the less likely automated algorithms will be able to detect your infringement.
Yeah,
So,
and I don't blame them. Just as another aside, like getting cleared for sampling or using stuff
mhm.
is such a nightmare. I remember when Philosophy Tube, she wanted to use, I think, David Bowie's Black Star in
Mhm.
her trans video. Like, it's a beautiful video. And I'm glad that she got the approval, but it took her like months because she was just emailing Sony of like, I would like to give you money and you let me play 1 minute of this song. How do we make that happen? And they were like, well, talk to this person. Well, talk to this. It just like, they just shuffled her around for like months. And she was just like, look, I'll wire you the money. Like, just tell me, just say I can use your goddamn song, please.
Jesus.
It was just a whole ordeal. So I don't blame anybody. It would slow down your production so much if you just wanted to go back and deal with some archaic record company to use some 70s horn sample that very few people probably remember unless it was really popular. Yeah, it's just a nightmare.
And as we discussed, most of the idea of using one of these things as a sample is that no one will recognize it. Like, that's the sort of point of the art form, is to disguise it and to sort of transmute it into a new type of music. So yeah, it's worth listening to.
Absolutely.
Let's move on.
That lovely vibe is the first minute of the first track of our second album today, Neon Impasse by City Girl from 2018. So not quite as new as your album. A little bit about the artist, because there's actually a fair amount about City Girl. I was able to find a good number of interviews, which is rare for artists on this podcast, but still anonymous. So City Girl is an anonymous Los Angeles-based producer. They've been doing lo-fi music for a while. City Girl is this character who's sort of visual, was a collaboration between the musician and the artist Vicky Sai, which we'll link to in the show notes. And they created this character, City Girl, who is in all of the like liner notes, track titles, album titles, art, etc., is just constantly referenced. And in the interview, they described that character as their vessel for creativity and storytelling, which we'll get into, but I think you really feel that in this album compared to what we just listened to. It's really not like a standard beat tape. I also want to talk about City Girl's aesthetic, the visuals. I'm just kind of going through this real quick. Otherwise, I would just spend far too long talking about this because I think they're really interesting as an artist after reading more about them. But the visual style of these albums, which is why I picked it, just again, album cover, loved it.
Oh, sure.
It's all done by this artist, Vicky Sai, who just does this like amazingly distinctive style of like just women vibing in pastel cityscapes or like fantasy landscapes. And they all just look great. Like I was just scrolling through her Twitter and just everything is killer. It's all just beautiful eye for color.
Yeah.
I really love it.
Yeah, like another one of their albums, Siren of the Formless, is an homage to Ophelia dying in the painting about Ophelia dead in the river from Hamlet. Yeah, no, I quite like it. It's very like kind of a cross between painterly and cartoon, like a bit anime-ish, but like
Mhm.
in a painterly way. I dig the style as well.
The other thing I thought was really interesting is that the character's name comes from the track City Girl by Kevin Shields, which was on the Lost in Translation soundtrack.
Hmm.
And Kevin Shields is like super influential because he's the like one of the founding members and leaders of My Bloody Valentine, who really popularized shoegaze, which is like another really lonely genre of music, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And combined with Lost in Translation, which is not something I would have thought of for like lo-fi influence, but makes sense as it's very also this very lost kind of melancholy movie about people very confused at their being at very different places in their life, but still both confused about what's going to happen and stuff. So I thought that was like a really interesting source of a citation that I would not have thought of for this genre, but made total sense as soon as I read it in the interview.
Yeah, I could totally see that. Like, yeah, I'd be interested at some point. I've listened to her newest album, Sea Girl, which is actually a lot of pop, like music with like lyrics and singing, not just instrumental. So at some point we should look at that. But Neon Impasse, it is a very different vibe than Ginseng in a lot of ways than Transitions, because for one thing, there's no sampling, and I feel it's more just overall more upbeat. Like, and maybe it's because it's not doesn't have that 70s sort of like nostalgia for bygone era and nostalgia for less popular music, but also I feel kind of like a sense of a Studio Ghibli, especially like Studio Ghibli movies have this very piano music that's very iconic in a lot of scenes, and a lot of lo-fi draws from that, and I feel like this album does as well. And then the synths are really, I think the word for me is quirky. Like they just kind of they wander in, they do some really weird, interesting things. They kind of wander out, just like a cat. You're not sure who actually owns the cat. It just kind of shows up at your house every once in a while. You're like, hello, and then it's gone. So yeah, just kind of wandering in and out. It's really, really, really cool. I really like that.
Yeah, I think that sort of quirkiness kind of speaks to their production method. So, slight correction, I don't think there's no samples on this album, because they said in interviews that they'll use samples for stuff like drums or like interesting background noises. So it's maybe a little more like field recording-y at times.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, but not sampling from like albums.
Right, not like grabbing a horn piece from some old jazz. At least not obviously. Some of the saxophone and stuff might be, just if they don't have access to recording a saxophone or don't want to do it as a virtual instrument. But anyway, they said that they really just kind of fire up their keyboard or their guitar and just kind of jam until they find something they think is interesting. And then like you kind of grow that out into a song. So I think probably their personality and how they're feeling at that time really comes through a lot more in that playing. I think it's, as much as we deal with like a lot of electronic music and stuff, I do think, I don't know, it's probably some bias or something, but I do think when you have like that person playing, there's just something there that's a little different, because stuff is not perfect in the same way. And you notice it, even if you don't notice it.
Yeah. I mean, pretty much, I wouldn't say all art, but most art is personal to some degree. The artist cannot help but put something of themselves in whatever art they make. I think this is obviously a good example of that, because there's a variety of moods represented in this album. So like whenever you're creating a longer work, you're not going to be the same mood the entire time. There's going to be great days or bad days or worse days. And
you piece all that together, I think, in an order that does make sense, because I do think there's a bit of like an emotional arc to this album. Like I think the middle few tracks are like far more melancholic and uncertain than the front, the first third and the back third. Especially like the first few are very upbeat, like just beautiful, sparkly. There's like cool chimes, cool synths, cool guitar that's like dreamy and chill, super relaxed. And then you kind of have the track Neon Impasse, the title track, and towards the back half, it just starts to get those chimes, which are like airy and upbeat and kind of happy sounds, against like these low synths are really interesting. So I think I'm going to play a little bit from that. So I think this tone shift in the back half of this track really marks where the middle of the album slows down. Like I said, there's like more wistful vocal samples. And I say it's a sample, but I think it was recorded for the album because there's a featuring credit.
Yeah, collaboration with Maru.
Yeah, so I assume they're singing, but it's just like that vocal sample is like really atypical and stands out. Doesn't sound like the rest of the album. It's like really lo-fi, like kind of that AM radio-y effect.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Also on track 6, the one you sampled, I do like the little reverb towards the end. And I do see that as like the progression of a night from, evening into the darkest part of the night all the way back to sunrise. Maybe is one way to look at it. That kind of dip in the middle in mood. But yeah, the Maru definitely, it's an interesting way of doing a vocal, like the radio is on in the other room. It's very distant and distorted a bit, but you can make it out. But yeah, it's
it's like distant thoughts, like kind of swirling around in the back of your head. That sort of persists through. And then there's the 2 tracks, The Light of Egress, which is probably aptly named, and Slipping into Ash-Filled Streets. They like you're waking up out of that. Like they sort of the opposite of Neon Impasse, where they end a little more upbeat, a little more hopeful, kind of than they started. And then the back few tracks of this album are great. You hit this track Palette, which is immediately like upbeatish jazz, like much more active drums. And there's like saxophone working. It's just like late night jams. It's like you kind of had like a bad late half of the afternoon and you come out and you're just ready to party. Go down to the jazz club and party.
Yeah, there was one of the earlier tracks, track 4, that I really like. These little, I don't know how to describe them, these kind of like fluttering little like string stabs, these little kind of, I really like that.
Tender Stare is the track. I love that track too, because it has all that awesome string stuff you just described, and then like halfway through passes it off to synths and other instruments, but it's not like a harsh transition. It just is cool. It's just so smooth.
Nothing in this album is harsh.
It's chill vibes all the way through. In that regard, anyway, in terms of harsh changes to the beat, we're definitely not in dark ambient territory of sneaking, starting to sneak on weird.
Yeah, but there is kind of this, I wouldn't say commonality with ambient music, where there is this kind of layering and texture of the sound, because City Girl really does like building up like multiple synth elements to create a very rich sound in parts, just bringing the synths in and out of different, like almost like these sweeps, and bells or chimes, and like, I also really like on track 7 too, there's these little bits of horn and a flute and that deep bass, and like it's very smooth. Yeah.
Speaking to that, I think that overall describes the production of this album, which is like it's much more lush, and I don't want to say like maximalist, but it has a lot of more obvious layering of instruments and stuff working together compared to Ginseng. Like the layering in the Ginseng album is very subtle and like part of the mood and supporting the beats. And I do think this album is more of a storytelling, and I think that's the goal with a lot of these, is putting yourself in the character City Girl's headspace and like just seeing what she's doing. And I think this album captures that really well.
Yeah, I like that. I think this sort of exemplifies the best of lo-fi, because it's not going to jump out and distract you from work, but like if you actually listen to it, it's rewarding, because you pick up on subtleties that you're not going to be noticing if you're, like most of us when we're listening to lo-fi doing something else, so yeah, it's the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's true of both these albums in a way. Like, I think this album really, really, really stood out to me. But just in general, it was so much more interesting and rewarding to hear this music as cohesive albums, which I mentioned at the beginning in the intro. But now that, we've talked about the albums and listened to it, I think that's the thing that stood out to me the most, is if these were single tracks, you just don't get that range of vibes, the range of jams. So the genre it's just so much more interesting to me. It's so much more connected. And for both of them, I really just want to listen to both their whole discographies now.
I have listened to Solitude from Ginseng, and that's a really good album. And it's, I wouldn't say it's sadder, but more melancholy. Like it's more wistful, more gazing into the distance, like thinking about your life kind of album, which is quite nice. And I think another thing is when you're putting it on a stream, you'll have like a really top tier song, like maybe from Ginseng or Neon Impasse from this album, and then it'll swap to like not as good of a lo-fi song, the kind of song that like people make fun of lo-fi for being very formulaic and cliche, and that kind of like disrupts it. So listening to full albums, hey, what an idea.
Artists exist for a reason. Consume what they want, consume as it was intended to be made. Like, I think that's always going to be the most rewarding experience.
Thanks for listening. This was a fun sojourn into the lands of lo-fi, learning about it. But we're not done quite yet with lo-fi, because in our next episode, we're going to be exploring Toonami, which is, of course, probably a generational touchstone for many of us, and certainly highly influential in the rise of lo-fi and its aesthetic. And we're going to be having a guest, Noah, who is on the podcast Thinking Too Much About Anime and has been featured on RPPR and the Mix 6. And he's just a podcast Ronin at this point.
Yeah, Noah's a good guy, and it was inspired to be a guest because he also streams. We'll get all shout outs next episode where you can connect with him. He was just talking about our lo-fi episode because it had just dropped. And he was just rattling all this shit off the top of his head about Toonami and music and artists and other stuff. I was like, oh, we got to get this guy on. This is so much easier than me researching it, is to just let somebody else come on who knows their shit and just talk to me about it. And then I get to learn. Yeah. So I'm really excited to get him on here.
Yeah. Toonami. Yeah. And again, I did watch quite a bit of Toonami back in the day. So it's, oh, nostalgia, that drug I need so much. Don't forget to check out our Patreon, patreon.com/NightClerkRadio. And of course, we'll have links in the show notes. We have a Discord. We have multiple bonus episodes now for our subscribers. And of course, they help make this podcast possible. So if you like the show, even if you just sign up for a month or two, it means the world to us. Thank you so much. And of course, if you want to talk to us, you can @ us on Twitter at Night Clerk Radio for our show, or me at Ross Payton on Twitter, or Burke is available at Burke McBurkinson. We also have a Facebook page, and we have a website, nightclerkradio.com. Tell your friends, tell your family, review and rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever you listen to. But stay out there. Don't get too stressed out in your hustle and grind. Just chill out and listen to some lo-fi.